to decide if he is going to run. We're all encouraging him to make that decision because time is running short.
He has made the decision. He has said firmly this week he is going to run. Do you want him to run?
I want him to do whatever he decides to do. And that's the way it is. Whatever he decides, we go with.
That was Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi capturing the anxiety of this moment for the Democratic Party and its leaders. And really, anyone in the country gets to share in that anxiety who cares about continuing to live in a democracy. In the 12 days since President Joe Biden's debate performance, it's clear that everything is on the line. A sitting and very accomplished and successful president is now an embattled presidential candidate. He's vowing to not quit, to stay in the race. He has told the nation that he will determine the fate of our democracy. Pelosi's comments, as you saw, were anything but an endorsement of President Joe Biden staying in, seemingly a reflection of the concerns of members of Congress, who she knows better than just about anyone else on that end of Pennsylvania Avenue. Sources tell NBC News that Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries plans to relay his caucus's concerns to President Joe Biden. All that is another influential voice in the Democratic Party. George Clooney, who hosted a fundraiser in Los Angeles for Joe Biden, has gone one step further even than Speaker Pelosi, saying in public what he says many Democrats are saying in private. In an op-ed he wrote in the New York Times, the Oscar-winning actor who saw President Joe Biden face-to-face last month made the sobering case that President Biden should step aside. Clooney writing this, quote, "The Joe Biden I was with 3 weeks ago at the fundraiser was not the Joe big effing deal Biden of 2010. He wasn't even the Joe Biden of 2020. He was the same man we all witnessed at the debate. We are not going to win in November with this president. On top of that, we won't win the House, and we're going to lose the Senate." Clooney closes with a final plea to the president, who he calls a friend, writing this, quote, "Joe Biden is a hero. He saved democracy in 2020. We need him to do it again in 2024. For more, let's bring in some of our favorite friends, political strategist, MSNBC senior political analyst Matt Dowd, and New York Times editorial board member, MSNBC political analyst Mark Gay. Matt Dowd, I know you arrived at some new reflections and thoughts in a post this morning. Do you want to share those with us?
Sure. I mean, you and I've had this conversation, and I've been, I think, very self-reflecting on all of this. And I had not publicly said that Joe Biden needs to step back. And in my view, Kamala Harris needs to be the nominee in this, because I wanted to give Joe Biden the grace and space to make that decision. I finally came to the conclusion I thought I had done that. It's almost 2 weeks, or is it 2 weeks today, that the debate happened. Nothing has improved since that debate. In fact, I could make an argument that things have gotten worse since the debate. I don't think the ABC interview with George Stephanopoulos helped at all. As a matter of fact, I think it was put off many people in the course of this. And so I believe that if you care about democracy, which I believe everybody listening does, and everybody here does, and if you want to keep the country away from the threat of Donald Trump, the only path realistically forward to get that done in any real predictable way is for Joe Biden to step back. And that's where I am. And the interesting thing is that's where most voters are. And that's where most of the Democratic Party is when you talk to their voters are. The majority of African Americans, of Hispanics, of younger voters, of new voters, all believe Joe Biden should step back, and there should be a new nominee in the course of this. And so this is not an elite versus the voters. This is the voters have come to this conclusion in the course of this. They would like to see it, and I would as well. I like George Clooney. I love Joe Biden. I think he's done great for the country, but we can't risk our country's democracy because we believed in Joe Biden yesterday. We have to understand what the political reality is.
Margay, let me turn this over to you, but let me just play another piece of sound, another sort of piece of analysis of where the race stands. This is Senator Michael Bennet.
Donald Trump is on track, I think, to win this election and maybe win it by a landslide and take with him the Senate and the House. And so for me, this isn't a question about polling. It's not a question about politics. It's a moral question about the future of our country, and I think it's critically important for us to come to grips with what we face if together we put this country on the path of electing Donald Trump again.
Let me also, I know how difficult this story is for my audience, but I'm not going to shield anyone from the news. This is new polling from Wisconsin, from AARP. 2024 election, for voters over the age of 50, Joe Biden's at 43%, Donald Trump is at 52%. The Senate race, Tammy Baldwin was running about 4 points ahead, but she's losing. Michael Bennet and George Clooney are the first two Democrats I've seen to say out loud something Democrats have been saying, elected Democrats have been saying privately since the days after the debate, and that is that the bottom will fall out of the polls and that it won't just be the White House that is lost and the political arrests and prosecutions that Trump has promised will come to pass. We'll all, if we even are still here, we'll cover those. But that the notion that Democrats could somehow manage Trump from Congress is ludicrous, because they would lose both they would lose the Senate and they would lose, I've heard the number 20 seats in the House. What do you make of this sort of wide gap between the public conversation and the private worry?
Well, you know, it's been a really tough story, I think, for all of us. But, you know, what's really frustrating here is that every day that the president continues to stay in the race and that the Democratic Party continues to be divided over him is a day that Donald Trump is gaining steam. Voters know that. And so there may be different views about what to do here, but voters are keenly aware of that. I think that they, you know, this whole experience has, over the past 2 weeks, kind of highlighted a bigger problem within the Democratic Party, which is just the lack of enthusiasm, the lack of confidence, and the lack of just a willingness to take a risk on somebody who might be a little bit more exciting or exciting to the base, at least. And so the longer this goes on, the more out of touch the party seems to its own voters. That is not a way to win an election. And I think that, you know, politicians are inherently cautious. We've seen some people stick their necks out, like Michael Bennet and others. But the silence from others is very frustrating to just voters I talk to and hear from, because they want to know what is the case to win. It is not acceptable to them, anybody who cares about democracy, to just wait and see at this moment. It's not acceptable to do nothing. I heard from some members of Congress privately over the past few days who said, well, it looks like, you know, Joe Biden's going to lose, but maybe we can stem the losses in Congress. That is not acceptable to the American public who is committed to democracy. People still want to win this election for democracy. This is about more than Joe Biden. And while he has been an incredible public servant, you know, that's why the board that I'm a member of has said that the best public service he can perform in this hour is to step down out of the race. And that's because this has always been about more than Joe Biden. I just hope that he can remember that this is a choice that's up to him. Ultimately, this has to be about the millions of Americans who could lose their rights and likely will if Donald Trump is elected. This cannot just be a comeback story about one man. And voters know that. The question is, does the president know that? Do those around him know that? And voters want to know that the party that is supposedly standing up for democracy sees the same sense of urgency that they do. They're not feeling that right now. They're hearing it from a few people here and there. But voters are saying to themselves, well, I thought this was existential, as the president has told us this election. If it's existential, then why are we being told to ignore what is in front of our own eyes and white knuckle this until November?
Well, I mean, Tim Miller, this is where it's too late, right? The goose is cooked. This is who is running the RNC platform policy process. Russ Vought, he is also one of the key authors of Project 2025. They are one and the same. They are indiscernible. And I understand that his base will believe whatever lies he feeds them. But Trump is, unfortunately now playing for voters beyond his base. Talk about the liability that is Project 2025 and David's reporting on the sort of crackpots that frequent Mar-a-Lago.
Well, clearly Trump knows it's a liability. That's why he's trying to walk away from it. I think that's pretty significant reporting right there from Vaughn. I mean, it's something that we all know, but having it be out of the horse's mouth that he says that these guys are going to do this blueprint, I think provides more ammo to the Democrats and to the forces that are trying to stop Donald Trump, because these aren't popular policies. And I think the other reality is we know these two things are linked, right? Because a lot of these officials that are around the Heritage Foundation and other groups are the types of people that are going to Mar-a-Lago. They're the types of people that would staff a Donald Trump administration. We know that Donald Trump is not a stickler for details, that he's not going to be the one worried about who, is the deputy undersecretary that is enforcing these rules at HHS and, at Department of Homeland Security and all of these scary, policies that the Heritage Foundation and others are laying out. I do want to add just one other layer to this. And I think that he gave a speech last night at his other club at Doral. And just, there are a lot of names that people are familiar with, like Vaughn mentioned Bannon and Flynn. But he shouted out from the stage another name, Laura Loomer, somebody that he has had his photo taken with also recently. She was recognized from the stage last night. This is a person that said on her podcast that she wants a white ethno state. She has been unapologetic in saying that she is Islamophobic. She has advanced conspiracies about how mass shootings are false flags aimed at taking our guns. It is important to understand who the people are going to be around Trump, who's going to be at Mar-a-Lago, who's going to be in his ear, and who's going to be staffing his administration. And so, because Trump is Trump, right, and he's a lot of word salad, I think it is incumbent on everybody to listen to the words of these people that are going to be around him, both at Project 2025 and at these kind of hangers-on like Laura Loomer, et cetera, that are around him at his various Florida clubs.
I mean, Tim, I need you to say a little bit more, because I think hangers-on, right, is an understatement. I mean, she is so toxic to the kinds of voters that Trump is doing things that make it clear that the people around him think that next week is about a grab for the independent voters, some of whom moved away from him between Charlottesville, the insurrection, and the conviction, right? So he shaved off some of the toxic edges so that he can stand there and say things like, I won't take away a woman's right to choose. Yes, he will. His code is leave it to the states. The platform also removes a ban on marriage equality. They eliminate language that's been in the Republican platform saying marriage is between a man and a woman. Laura Loomer is like 10 train stops beyond right-wing extremism. Say more.
Yeah. Laura Loomer tried to run for Congress and was rejected by Republican primary voters who usually like to choose the craziest SOB in the race. So that shows you how extreme these people are. This is to be acknowledged from the stage. For Trump, it's not just like she was at an event or in a photo line, right? Trump is on stage last night in Doral, and he's complimenting her and he's shouting her out. Like, this is somebody that is an unapologetic white nationalist, somebody that is an unapologetic conspiracy theorist and Islamophobe, right? So that's just one example. I think it's important to talk about her, right? Because people know, Flynn, Bannon, who knows who will actually be around. What we know is these are the type of people that are going to staff this next administration. These are the type of people, to David's reporting, who are going to be around him. That's really what I meant by hangers-on. Who are going to be around him at Mar-a-Lago and have their voice in his ear. It's not going to be responsible public servants. It's not going to be experts on subject matter. It is going to be far-right extremists that have gone much further than even Trump has gone in his rhetoric, and they're going to be the ones implementing the policy and influencing him. And I think that's the critical thing to understand about a Trump 2.0.
Vaughn, the disorienting element of the Trump story is that he is successful at sort of moving the frame, right? Moving the Overton window. So where Matt Schlapp and CPAC was so galling to people who watched it, and Matt Gaetz, he's now surrounded by something totally different, not people who are ex-government officials, ex-policymakers, political, whatever, and they were all viewed as extreme and politically toxic in the moment. But this new group and the characters that are at Mar-a-Lago and in David's story are just an entirely different crowd.
And I think that that's why there's an entirely different conversation also who would join the administration, not only at the secretary level, but also at the agency head level in 2025. And I think, though, if I may, I think this is, to a certain extent, 2024 is the year that Trump has allowed to be Donald Trump. I know we've been talking about that for 9 years, but ever since November of 2022, his senior advisor, Susie Wiles, has been running his 2024 campaign. And there has been very little palace chaos. There has been no turnover of major staff. And in large part, I am told by those within and outside of the campaign, the reason for that is because Susie Wiles has not tried to close the door to anybody in terms of their access to Donald Trump, much in the way that the door to Mar-a-Lago is open, right? Even to the likes of Nick Fuentes, who finds his way inside of Mar-a-Lago. And so Susie Wiles, senior advisor to Trump, is not acting as a gatekeeper per se. Donald Trump right now is his own gatekeeper. And so therefore him, it is provided an opportunity to dismantle his Republican opponents through the GOP primary process earlier this year. And now he's ahead in polling nationally against Joe Biden. And so for Donald Trump, he feels like this is a moment where he has been wholly allowed to be himself, surround himself with those who perhaps can be considered extreme or far right, yet it has not appeared to politically harm him, at least in his mind, 4 months out from this November election.
David, it strikes me that we're almost 18 minutes into this conversation, and the idea of sort of profiteering over the political. Obviously, he's out of government, but there's no indication that he wouldn't sort of ring the U.S. government for everything it's worth if he were to prevail. Just talk about something that was central to your beat during the years of the Trump presidency.
Well, we know that even while he was president, he would do things like go to his clubs very often. The Secret Service has to follow him to protect him. And then he would charge his own protectors and keep the money. He charged the Secret Service rates up to $650 a night for hotel rooms. That was the first time around when he was, in theory, trying to sort of stay on the right side of ethical lines so he could run for re-election. This Trump, if re-elected, would not have to worry about that. And so I think a lot of the safeguards, the things that they said they were going to do, and sometimes actually did while he was president, you know, not making new deals with foreign governments, not making new overseas deals at all, trying to supposedly give back some of the profits of their foreign business dealings and dealings with the U.S. government. It doesn't seem like they would do any of that. In fact, he hasn't promised any of that, and it doesn't seem like his voters are expecting him to do it. So, yes, the next time around, not faced with any need to run for re-election, I don't think we'd see Trump even as restrained as he was. It would be a little bit different because the Trump Hotel in D.C. is gone. That was the main place. It was the most convenient place for people who wanted to sort of butter him up to also pay him. But people could still find a way, and it doesn't seem like he would make any effort to turn that away now.
Quote the beloved character Stefan from Saturday Night Live. This place has everything. A real housewife, a guy who played Hercules, an ex-national security advisor, an ex-president of the United States, and who can forget, for more than 1 year, there were even nuclear secrets stashed away in the bathrooms in the basement. Brand new reporting from the New York Times swings open the doors to Donald Trump's private club, Mar-a-Lago. It reveals a hotbed of far-right extremism fueled by proximity to the ex-president, now presumptive Republican presidential nominee. It gives us a glimpse into the ideologues, the conspiracy theorists, the outright crackpots and weirdos that Donald Trump spends his free time with as he makes a third run for the White House. As the New York Times reports, quote, MAGA is a movement, and Mar-a-Lago, its epicenter. A look at who walks those gilded halls is another piece of the puzzle that helps us understand how grave and high the stakes are of November's presidential election. If Donald Trump manages to make the Oval Office the, quote, seat of criminality, as Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson has now famously warned and fears, Mar-a-Lago could become its southern satellite. The Times reports that dozens of members of Congress have made the trip to Mar-a-Lago to kiss the ring. It includes, of course, the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. Times also reports this, quote, since Trump left office and as he has increasingly aligned with the extreme fringe of the Republican Party, photos posted on social media of people and events at Mar-a-Lago reflect that right-wing personalities have become more woven into the tapestry of the club. That includes, according to the Times report, quote, more than 24 speakers from the Reawaken America tour. That's a far-right Christian nationalist roadshow led in part by Mike Flynn. They have visited Mar-a-Lago since Trump left office. Dinesh D'Souza, a right-wing commentator turned right-wing filmmaker, has held premieres for at least 2 of his movies. One, quote, which promoted the lie that the 2020 election was stolen. The other, quote, alleged the high-level weaponization of the justice system against conservatives. New video from the Times reveals the kind of dangerous conspiracy theory-fueled rhetoric that is heard day in and day out at Mar-a-Lago.
A fringe minority who hates this country, bringing communism to our shores.
They destroy life and freedom and family.
Radical, atheist, Marxists.
These radical left lunatics want to interfere with our elections.
They think they can continue to steal elections.
The election that we all knew was stolen.
If we don't have a fair election, right, then we don't have a country.
You can get all that and more at Mar-a-Lago. Over the years, Donald Trump has reaped the financial rewards for turning his private club into the center of one of 2 of America's major political parties as it morphed into an authoritarian movement. Times reports this, quote, in this gilded echo chamber, Trump enjoys unwavering devotion and collects the staggering price of admission. Records reveal that profits, quote, hit a peak in 2017 as the club added new customers, including the U.S. government, which paid for bedrooms used by Secret Service agents and liquor drunk by Trump's aides, without losing its existing ones, like the charities that rented out the club's ballrooms for fundraiser galas. But many of those charity customers began to flee Mar-a-Lago during Trump's presidency. Since Trump left office, however, Mar-a-Lago's profits have shot up again, even as the club has been in the headlines for its role in both the New York civil case and one of several criminal cases against Trump. The company Donald Trump keeps and what it ushers in with him if he's reelected in November is where we begin today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. New York Times investigative reporter David Fahrenthold is here. His byline is on that reporting we read from. Also joining us, NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard and former RNC spokesman, host of the Bulwark podcast, Tim Miller's here. David, take us through what you and your colleagues are reporting.
Well, what we found was a real wholesale shift in what Mar-a-Lago is and who it caters to. Even when President Trump got elected, it was mainly still aimed at the Palm Beach society. It was set up to serve rich people who live in Palm Beach and the events that they went to. So there were a lot of Red Cross balls, Salvation Army balls, really, large charity events. Most of those groups began to leave after 2017 because of what Trump said. We all remember he said there were very fine people on both sides of what happened in Charlottesville, that violent rally. So those charity customers start to leave, and the Mar-a-Lago's profit margin goes way down. What we've seen is that while he was president, but especially since he's been president, that a whole bunch of new groups started to come in, both political campaigns, including his own campaign, but also a lot of other, sometimes very new MAGA-aligned groups, nonprofits or political groups that have events there, and they've more than replaced what he lost when the society customers left. In fact, Mar-a-Lago now appears to be more profitable than it has been at any time in the last 20 years.
I mean, the elephant in the room, I guess there are a lot of elephants in the room. It's a room full of elephants, but it's obviously the scene of serious felony crimes. It's where he stole and refused to return classified documents. Let me show you what one of the witnesses, a former, I believe, former employee, maybe still works there, of Mar-a-Lago, had to say about the intermingling of the official and the sort of sordid memberships.
There was a member, Anthony Pratt, who he was coming, he flew in the night before.
He's an Australian billionaire.
He finishes his meeting with the former president, gets in the car, and his chief of staff says, "How did the meeting go?" Pratt, without saying, just says, "He told me," and it would be, U.S. military, classified information of what he told them about Russian submarines and U.S. submarines. And that's really all I remember hearing, and I went, what? I'm thinking this. I'm in the car, I'm like, did I just hear that? So it wasn't like, oh, the meeting went well, we talked about it. He went straight to the point. He told me that the U.S. subs and with the Russian subs and, something that would more than likely, in my mind, be classified.
So it was clear to you that he was basically seeking access to Trump.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
David Fahrenthold, there's an echo of the reporting that's just sort of your hallmark of exquisitely reported and detailed investigative reporting, but you can't read it without worrying about what Mar-a-Lago would become if Trump were to prevail in November. Can you just pull that thread for us a little bit?
Yeah, the Mar-a-Lago, the people that are there, and especially the people that are paying him, it's a specific brand of Republican politics. And it is now, what we would have described as the right fringe a few years ago, now moving closer to the mainstream. But the positions they hold are things like, January 6th was an inside job of the federal government. The 2020 election was stolen. Pizzagate, this conspiracy theory that pedophiles in the Democratic Party are killing children. All those things are real in this world. Obviously, in real life, they're all false. It's that kind of sort of apocalyptic, conspiratorial, and often just wrong reality that is sort of suffuses the place and that Trump lives in now and encourages them by taking their business, but also by showing up at their events and accepting their awards. So what he's done there is take this far right fringe, the people that are paying him there, and help them move to the center of the party, which is him, right? The center of the party is just physically him. So by bringing those people around him, he's given them access to power and a path to even greater influence if he wins in the fall.
Von Hilliard, Trump is involved in a little bit of a two-step with Project 2025 not because he doesn't agree with everything they're for, but because he sees how polarizing and unpopular a lot of what they're for is. He can read a poll. He sees that he's got some political wind at his back right now, and he knows that Project 2025 is a vulnerability. Project 2025's leaders are intermingled in this fringe sort of cohort that Trump is one and the same with now. Can you just talk about this move to, the fringe seems to understate it to the extreme?
Right. I think this is sort of the two ways that Donald Trump is trying to play this. In a lot of ways, he is not closing the door on anybody like a Michael Flynn or a Steve Bannon. The door is open as it has ever been to some of these right-wing figures who have made very more than questionable statements in the past. On the other hand, there is suddenly, 4 months out from a presidential election, there are serious questions about the implications politically about some of the policies that some of these individuals have spoken out loud or written on paper that Donald Trump has now, by association, become affiliated with. And I think the interesting part about Project 2025 specifically, Nicolle, is the fact that I was going through just this afternoon before joining you some old speeches of Donald Trump. And back in 2022, when folks were maybe not listening to every speech of his, I was going through one in April of 2022. It was at a Heritage Foundation dinner down in Florida where Donald Trump was the keynote speaker, and he was talking about the Heritage Foundation, and this was his exact quote, "This is a great group, and they're going to lay the groundwork and detailed plans for exactly what our movement will do and what your movement will do when the American people give us a colossal mandate to save America, and that's coming." Donald Trump giving a tip of the hat to the work that Heritage Foundation was putting together in the form of what would be known in early 2023 as Project 2025 and that 900-page document, a policy roadmap here. Donald Trump, though, 4 months out from the general election, and despite his close associations with those authors of it, is now understanding that a majority of Americans, at least on some of the policies, are not keen on some of what is written inside of that very policy.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.